Hello, this is Jason, and a new story on my author's channel.
The first drops of rain were insignificant. They fell casually, with a soft sound, as if trying to warn, but not yet daring to announce themselves. Clouds darkened on the horizon, ready to explode into a storm. Lieutenant Emily Dunn stood on a military training field, her eyes fixed on the emptiness where the horizon seemed to be melting. There was something strange inside her, uncontrollably strange. She tried again and again to figure out what exactly was wrong with this weather. Time was elusive, and the space around her seemed to tremble slightly. A thought struck her like lightning. Something was wrong. She turned, looking at her comrades. Everyone was absorbed in the drill, as usual. The instructor, the speaker, the soldiers following orders, all of it moving with perfect precision, as if from another world. But Emily, standing in the center of it all, felt a strange dissonance, as if her consciousness were in a slightly different place, in a different time. She looked up at the sky again. The rain was getting heavier. An unknown tension in the air was making her hair stand on end. Behind her, in the distance, on the horizon, a dark cloud that seemed not to move, but was slowly growing, turned her gaze to itself. It couldn't be. Hurricane Ida was several hundred miles away. Or was it? The instructor's words, clear and calm a second ago, now sounded like an echo. Everything around her seemed to slow down, warped, and her heart beat faster. She took a step forward, but the ground beneath her feet was strangely viscous, as if her consciousness was trying to get out of some trap that she herself did not recognize. Fear began to threaten inside. But when Emily tried to hold her breath, her eyes, filled with anxiety, met the mirrored eyes of the soldiers. They did not notice anything. For them, the world remained the same. Or was it? She grabbed the commander's console from the radio, but the sound was becoming increasingly distorted before her eyes. Isn't that so? The phrase came again, like a distant echo from another time. Emily realized that she shouldn't be here in this exercise. But it was too late. Emily Dunn was born and raised in a small town on the coast. Everything she knew about the world was connected with simple and understandable things. Her father's work on an oil rig, evenings with friends on the beach, the constant silence when another hurricane rose in the ocean and made the city freeze in anticipation. She never thought that her life would extend beyond this small world. But it so happened that she found herself in the army, and her natural inclination for discipline and analytical thinking made her an ideal candidate for participation in military exercises. These exercises she took part in were often called simulations, but Emily always felt there was more to them than just training. Sometimes, at night, she would wake up feeling trapped in some kind of temporal paradox, as if time and space were playing tricks on her, blurring the lines between reality and something irrational. But despite these strange sensations, she kept moving forward because she couldn't afford to doubt herself. Some of her colleagues had told her that they were exploring too much, and that it was better to just follow orders without asking too many questions. Emily had always felt that this superficial understanding of what was happening was not the whole story. So she dug through the archives, studied the documents, tried to find an explanation for what was happening outside the simulations. The instructors would often say, "Understand, this is all for your safety," and that seemed to be the end of it. But Emily didn't feel that it was that simple. Something about this place didn't add up, as if reality was slightly distorted. Her latest assignment was unusual. Hurricane Ida, which she thought had just swept through Louisiana, was already on its way, heading straight for their desert training base. They were all essentially human targets in a training program, but Emily, who sensed that there was more to every event than just a storm, couldn't let it go. She listened to the forecast tapes, but they seemed inconsistent, constant discrepancies in the hours, shifting locations of the hurricane. Every day she brought up her questions at meetings, but they always told her the same thing: you can't be sure of the details. We're all part of a big exercise, and it's important to understand that things don't always go according to plan. It was a warning, but it wasn't meant seriously. But she couldn't let it go. It all seemed like some kind of terrifying experiment in which they were just pawns. Soon, behind the routine training, with disaster simulations and learning rescue procedures, the feeling began to grow that something was hidden from everyone. When the moment came when Emily looked out the window of the barracks alone, her gaze came across strange dark traces in the sky, not of natural origin. The winds that seemed so familiar filled the air not with the sounds of nature, but with the sounds of machines. She tried to put her thoughts in order, but every step confused her more and more. The instructors, The commanders, they all became somehow foggy figures, merging into one subordinate system where there was no place for either logic or humanity. They were just a part of something huge, unknown. One of the soldiers, Thomas, once told her that he heard strange whispers in the radio traffic. "It's like someone is trying to give us a message, but we don't understand it," he said breathlessly as they sat in the mess hall. Emily listened silently, but her eyes were glued to the screen in their command center, where the IDA's direction was displayed. The knowledge they received was always tinged with uncertainty. Everything seemed to be under control, but she only felt that it was under control from their reports. The reality was different. "Emily," Thomas said quietly, "have you ever noticed how sometimes time seems to drag or just disappear? It's like we stop noticing that there's something bigger between us and this storm. Something we can't explain." She didn't answer. An image flashed on the screen in front of her. The hurricane with its distinctive yellow mark was getting closer, and its trajectory looked wrong. Why did the forecasts keep changing directions and dates? Why did they continue to follow the usual plan, knowing that the only way to encounter the hurricane was if the hurricane itself was part of something much more complex? She wiped her palms on her jacket, but her head was still buzzing. At the last moment, she noticed something strange on one of the screens. It was a short sequence of numbers that she didn't have time to make out. But her eyes froze in horror when she saw the same code of numbers was repeated in another place, on the mark that showed the trajectory of the hurricane. The seconds slowed down. And with each new thought she felt more and more how her world was sliding into an abyss into which no one had invited her. Emily's hands were shaking when she returned to her tent. She sat down on one of the chairs, thoughtfully wiping the dirt off her boot. Images kept running through her head, the code of numbers guiding the hurricane, Thomas's anxious words, the shaky boundary that separated reality from what she felt as space breaking apart. Why wasn't the hurricane moving the way it should on the screen? Why were the last trajectory marks inaccurate? She tried to rationalize that it could be a system error, but her mind refused to accept it each time. No, it couldn't be an error. There was still a sound in her ears, like the whispers she had heard for the last few days, a subtle vibration in the air that was creeping into her consciousness. It wasn't just the wind or the noise of machinery. It was something far more complex and perhaps not entirely explainable. A sense of something slipping between worlds. And it wasn't a coincidence. The sound she perceived wasn't the static of a radio wave, it was the sound of time itself, beginning to shift. Reality warped in its movement. Seconds grew long, moments such that no one noticed they were gone. "Wy переходим на экстренную меру. Его голос стал еще более напряженным. Ураган перемещается быстрее, чем ожидалось. Мы находимся на грани. Все еще проводим расчеты, но могу сообщить, что сам ураган начал изменять свое поведение. Он перемещается в нехарактерное для себя место. По всем расчетам, его траектория должна была пройти севернее, но теперь он направляется прямо на нас. Все данные противоречат прогнозу." Эмили напряглась, глаза в окно, которое теперь казалось ей не просто стеклом, а барьером между двумя мирами. Где-то далеко, на горизонте, начался вихрь. Он был плотным, но не как обычный ураган. Это было что-то другое, не имеющее аналога в привычных метеорологических моделях. She stood up quickly, fumbling around on the table for her radio, but her gaze fell on the map where the hurricane's path was drawn. And something about those lines and marks caught her attention again. She picked up a ruler, placed it along the wind directions, and discovered that the path was unnaturally crooked. It didn't move like it did in reality, not in a straight line. A thought flashed through her mind. Those crooked lines weren't just errors in forecasts. They were registered by the consciousness, registering changes that were happening in their perception of reality. But how is this possible? Emily walked over to the wall and pressed a button. The creaking of the speakers became more pronounced, and then something else caught her attention, the same sequence of numbers she had seen on the screen earlier. It was back. But now they weren't just a bunch of numbers. They were connected to the hurricane's path. It was like an alarm for her consciousness. Her heart sank. No, she couldn't be the only one who noticed such anomalies. The door opened and Thomas walked in. He looked at her curiously, as if he knew she was hiding something, but he couldn't figure out what it was. "Did you see that?" he asked, pointing to the screen where the hurricane's strange behavior was displayed. It's It's impossible. I know, she answered quietly. It's changing its trajectory. And it looks like the hurricane itself is. Not what we expected. Thomas walked over to the table and studied the map carefully. He glanced at it, then returned to the screen. We must be prepared to evacuate, he said, unless we want to remain trapped in this anomaly. Emily stood by the map, still pondering Thomas's words. He was right. Evacuation was the only sensible course of action. But something inside her resisted the thought, as if she knew that any retreat, any movement toward ordinary reality, was a step toward an even deeper delusion. She took a deep breath and turned to the screen. It showed more than just the hurricane's trajectory. Now she saw that the storm itself had begun to twist its space. Like a giant veil that was gradually bending and distorting, abstract and not entirely clear movements flickered across the screen. As if the hurricane itself were becoming part of something else, something that went beyond the usual meteorological laws. Thomas continued to study the map, his fingers sliding across the screens, drawing lines, trying to figure out what exactly was going on. Emily could feel his tension growing, but she couldn't allow herself to panic. She had to figure this out before it got out of hand. We have to figure out what this is. Her voice was almost emotionless, but there was a sharp inner impulse behind it. This isn't just a hurricane. And it's not just a forecast error. Thomas, continuing to watch what was happening, looked up. You don't think this is a coincidence? His question was quiet, but there was something alarming in it. Emily nodded. All of this, the trajectory distortions, the strange number codes, the ineffable sound that filled the air, all of it told her they were on the brink of something far more dangerous and inexplicable. She thought about what was happening to her consciousness. These time shifts she was feeling couldn't just be her mind playing tricks. This was more than paranoia, something that was blurring her boundaries, disrupting her normal perception. It's not an accident, she repeated, her eyes still on the screen. I'm sure of it. There's something wrong with this hurricane. And maybe there's something wrong with us, with the way we perceive reality. Thomas paused, his eyes darting over the map. He could have asked more, but he seemed to already understand that the answers weren't on the surface. Suddenly, his gaze lingered on one part of the map where another anomaly had appeared. Several markers, strange signatures that shouldn't have been there. Emily noticed his tense silence. Did you see something? She asked. Thomas didn't answer right away. He stood there for a moment, then walked over to the table, pulled the map over, and leaned over. This can't be. He pointed to the red mark. We've already passed through this area, but why is it appearing again? Emily moved closer and studied the map. The red mark was indeed the mark of the place they had passed through a few hours ago, but now it was back in the center of their route. Turning her head, Emily noticed that the time on her watch had slowed down strangely. She couldn't tell exactly what had happened, but the hands had been moving faster a few minutes ago. Are we back to where we were? Her voice was almost a whisper. Thomas nodded, his eyes still on the screen. There was something wrong with this time. It seemed to be folding, returning them to the same moment, to the same point. Emily remembered standing on the training field and feeling as if she had crossed an invisible line, where space and time became malleable and her senses began to warp. Thomas raised his hand and pointed to another screen. It was flashing the same sequence of numbers she had seen before, but now the numbers were blurrier, as if the numbers themselves were floating, distorting in the moment, as if they were trying to pass from one dimension to another. She felt her heart pounding. She knew this was no accident. All these anomalies, all these inexplicable events, this was the first step toward unraveling what was happening. We're there again. We're going back to that moment, she said quietly, more to herself than to anyone. Thomas froze, then slowly turned to face her. Do you think we're stuck in this moment? In some kind of time paradox? Emily didn't answer right away. Time did feel strange. This sense that they were not only meeting the hurricane in another place and time, but that they were returning to this moment over and over again. And this time loop might not just be random. The thought occurred to her that the hurricane might not have caused this rupture. It was merely a catalyst. The collision of these two forces, human reality and something much deeper, something that lurked beyond perception, might be what was starting this endless loop. Or it might be part of some grand plan they couldn't yet understand. We're not just here, she said, her eyes fixed on the screen. This isn't a hurricane we're seeing. It's part of something else. Like time itself is breaking. We're trapped somewhere. We're here to be part of this cycle. Thomas turned to face her, his face pale. He clearly felt the same fear she did. This wasn't just a drill or a storm. This was something far more sinister. "How is this possible?" he whispered. We can't be part of this. We can't stay here. Something has to be done." But Emily knew that this was no longer a matter of will. Will played no role here. They were moving toward the unknown, and every step they took only deepened this strange, endless circle. Every action, every choice, was just another element in an already predetermined game. Her gaze fell on that strange code of numbers again. Now it was fading, but somewhere in the back of Emily's mind she was sure it wasn't gone. It was just waiting for the next cycle. "It's not as we think, Thomas," she said, as if warning him. "We must be prepared to never get out of here." Emily didn't know how much time had passed since she'd spoken those words. Time had become a blur again. Moments felt like hours, and reality itself seemed to slow down, trying to make sense of the break. It was as if she and Thomas were standing in the shadow of something larger than the storm. But it was something they couldn't see. It slid along the edges of their perception, like fog that dissipated when they tried to peer into it. The map on the screen kept showing strange anomalies, and even though Emily tried to analyze the data, something about it didn't add up. She couldn't figure out what it was. Forgotten corners, distorted routes, strange repeating marks on the route's contour, like imprints of time that violated all laws of logic. Each new mark pointed to a repeating moment, as if they were returning to the same place no matter where they went. When Emily turned to Thomas, she saw his hand sliding helplessly over the control panel, trying to make sense of something that was impossible to understand. He couldn't think. He couldn't make decisions because his mind was overloaded, and his gaze, lost in the thousands of lines and dots on the screen, had no purpose. He no longer saw a way out. "We can't fix this," he said finally, his voice a quiet surrender. "Not here, not with this. I don't understand what's happening. We can't control anything." Emily shook her head. His words echoed in her mind, but the answer was already there, like a long-planned move. She couldn't afford to panic. She couldn't afford to admit that this was beyond their capabilities. It wasn't just important to their survival, it was important to reality itself. Understanding what was happening, even partially, was the only way to defeat this inexplicable force. "We can't give up," she said firmly, though her voice was quiet. "We have to look for patterns, look for a reason that might be hidden behind all of this. We can't just let go." Thomas turned to face her, his eyes glittering, but there was not only confusion in that look, but also a desire for understanding. "You want us to find the culprit?" he asked with a hint of irony. "The culprit that the hurricane broke reality? The culprit that we found ourselves stuck in some kind of paradoxical time?" "The culprit," she replied with the same calm, "or the reason. We are looking for it. Here. Now. What is happening is not an accident. We are on the edge, and if we do not understand what is behind this, it will consume us. It will consume everything." She looked around the space, and at that moment she felt how even the walls of the tent began to shift. Everything was no longer the same as before. The distorted and blurred lines of the contours, the barely perceptible vibrations in the air, every element suggested that they were surrounded not only by physical space, but also by something larger, elusive. This feeling was akin to a trap that they had created for themselves, believing in a reality that in fact ceased to exist in its usual form. Thomas, noticing her gaze, slowly stood up. He seemed exhausted, his movements were constrained, and even the air around him became heavy. He began to walk around the table, as if trying to find a solution, but judging by his behavior, there was no solution. In parallel with his internal search, she felt how her own body refused to submit to the usual order. "Do you feel it?" he suddenly asked, stopping in place and turning to face her. Emily nodded. It was an odd feeling. It wasn't anything specific, but there was a charge in the air, like they were part of something that defied description. Nothing they were experiencing should have happened in the real world. It was out of place, like a mistake accidentally left in a line of code. "We can't just sit here," Thomas said, his voice full of internal struggle. "We have to at least try to understand what's going on. This is our last chance." Emily felt his words awaken something important in her, but she couldn't immediately place what it was. She walked over to the control panels and looked at the screen again. This time, something had changed. The hurricane's trajectory was no longer chaotic. It was smooth and even, as if it were following some invisible line, but the line wasn't quite straight. It curved, and its curves were unusual, too smooth, too sure. It was like a footprint in the sand, made not by a person, but by something bigger. Emily jumped up and walked over to the map. There was a mark on it that was repeated again, but this time the mark was much brighter, as if burned in. It was a place they had visited before. But why was it there again? Why was this place so significant? "We have to get back there," she said to Thomas. Thomas instantly turned away from the screen, his face full of confusion. "Are you serious? We can't go back there. We just decided it was dangerous." Emily turned to him. She understood his doubts, but her intuition told her that they had to go back. This cycle could not end until they were in that place, until they unraveled the knot that bound them to this paradox. "We have to do this." Her voice was firm. "We have to find the point where it all began. It may be the only way to return reality to its normal state." Thomas stared at her in silence, his gaze growing more and more intense. Then he took a deep breath, as if accepting the inevitability of what was happening. The words he spoke were filled with anxiety and uncertainty. "If we go back there, then what will we find?" Emily didn't answer right away. Thomas's words hung in the air like a threat, wrapping themselves around them, keeping them frozen on the edge of action. What would they find if they returned there? The question was as simple as it was meaningful. There was something behind that place, something that wasn't just about their survival, but something that had disrupted the very existence of their reality. She clenched her fists, trying to gather her thoughts, but the answer, as always, was in her subconscious, where it had all been written long ago. She knew that the only way to put everything back into place was to understand what had destroyed this order. If only she could say exactly what was happening to her perception. Her mind rebelled against the question, against the fact that they were standing before something that was bigger than a hurricane, bigger than the physical world. Everything seemed to lie beyond the boundaries of logic and order. "We can't understand anything until we get there," she said finally, almost in a whisper, as if the words were asking to be uttered by themselves. "If we don't go back, we won't get out of this vicious circle. We'll be stuck here. And maybe we'll become part of this paradox. We need to understand what happened here." Thomas didn't answer, but his gaze became clearer, as if he still took her words as a last hope. It was as if he had reconciled himself to the fact that they couldn't stay in one place. Time moved, but in its own strange, non-linear way, and every moment they lost in this suspended state only took them further away from the possibility of solving the problem. Time continued to confuse them. Everything around them seemed to be happening outside the rules. "We have to go," Emily said, without waiting for his answer. She felt like her whole being was focused on this decision now. This was the moment when they had to move, just move forward, and she knew that no matter what was waiting for them in that place, they couldn't stop. Thomas stared at her, his gaze fixed on hers. There was not only weariness in his eyes, but also desperation. He knew that this might be their last chance, but he also knew that Emily's decision might be dangerous. In that moment, he realized, there was no room for doubt. If they didn't step forward, if they didn't go to where it all began, then this strange, broken reality would swallow them up. "Let's go," he said, gathering his strength. His voice was determined, but there was still a shadow of fear in it. "If it's necessary, then we'll go." They set out toward a place that was back on their route. It was a place that seemed to exist in both the past and the future. As they moved toward it, each step intensified the feeling that everything around them was changing. With each passing moment, reality became more fragile. Emily felt the space around them begin to blur, as if it itself was resisting their movement. The nature of their world was disrupted, and even the air seemed to vibrate in response to their steps. Soon they found themselves in the field where they had first noticed the strange anomalies. Here, in this place, everything was the same as before, the fog descending on the ground, the sky that was getting darker. But now, as Emily and Thomas stood here, everything felt different. The fog had become thicker. It was like a living thing, a creeping darkness that was squeezing the space around it. "We're almost there," Emily whispered, her eyes fixed on the horizon. She felt the ground beneath her feet begin to vibrate. Thomas stopped next to her, his hands sliding over the panel, trying to reconnect with the outside world, but the connection was gone. He couldn't get a single signal marker, no confirmation. Their companions who had been standing in the command center had disappeared from view, as if they were part of what was happening around them. "No signal. Everything's gone," Thomas said, turning to her with a confused look. Emily didn't answer. She stood there, breathing deeply into the air, which was now thick with something entirely new, a scent that couldn't be explained. It was the scent of a reality being torn apart, something that couldn't exist in their world. But in this moment, in this place, it was. She stepped forward and stopped at what had once seemed like a normal military training ground. But it was different now. Everything about it was distorted, and the ground beneath her feet seemed to be sinking, as if they were standing on the edge of something incomprehensible. "It's here," she said with an expression as if something invisible was pulling her towards itself. Thomas walked up to her and tried to look at what she saw, but nothing had changed. The ground was the same as before, but there was something different in her eyes. She saw something he couldn't see. "This isn't just a place," she whispered. "This is a point of intersection. This is where everything breaks down." Thomas frowned, but there was concern in his eyes. He felt that her words sounded not like a simple assumption, but like the realization of the inevitable. He came closer to her, and they both stood before this place that seemed about to open up. At that moment, the fog around them began to thicken, and the air seemed to fill with an indescribable heaviness. "We can't just stand there," Thomas said. "We have to move." Emily nodded and stepped forward, as if each step brought her closer to a solution. This wasn't just a place. This wasn't just a field. This was a point where time layers intersected, a place where reality collapsed and merged with another world, another time. And they were here to see it happen. Thomas followed her. And at that moment, the sky above them darkened again, and the ground beneath their feet seemed to shake. Everything became unbearably real, and at the same time, unreal. And then something happened that no one could explain. As they approached the center of this distorted field, everything around them began to disappear. As everything around them began to disappear, Emily felt her body dissolving into thin air. At first, a light, almost imperceptible tremor in her legs, then more and more strongly, and now each of her steps made the ground beneath her feet disappear, like sand flowing through her fingers. But this emptiness was not ordinary. It was filled with a heavy, oppressive feeling, as if they were stepping across the edge of reality in parallel worlds. It was dark around, but this darkness was not just the absence of light. It was deep, alive, foggy, dense, like an old memory that you do not want to forget, but do not know how to cope with it. Thomas stood there, his gaze focused on Emily, but his eyes seemed to be elsewhere, at another time. He didn't move, as if he too felt the space around him losing its familiar contours, as if their world had not simply been disrupted, but was shifting according to some strange laws that went beyond any understanding. "What is it?" Tom's voice was so horrified that Emily felt a chill run down her spine. She couldn't answer, couldn't explain exactly what was happening because she barely understood it herself. Everything seemed to slow down. The seconds stretched, and Emily caught Tom's eye and realized that they were both seeing the same thing. It was as if an invisible door to another reality was opening before them. Not just another place, but another dimension, another time that was no longer their own. She saw how the distorted geometry of the field ceased to be familiar before their eyes. Now everything seemed to be turned inside out, as if the world no longer obeyed the laws of physics. She saw lines that should not exist, tectonic cracks that shifted space, creating new paths and angles, in ways that had not been there before. "We're in a different time," she said quietly. It wasn't a guess, but an awareness. It wasn't just a feeling. It was knowing. Thomas said nothing, but his body responded. He stepped forward, as if seeking a way through this distortion. But each step became more difficult. The ground beneath his feet shook, and it seemed as if it would swallow him up, pull him into this strange, inexplicable space. Emily took another step. In her hands was the same mapping device they had used to track the hurricane, but now everything on the device's screen was looking strange. The coordinate lines were shifting, the trajectory markers were becoming blurry, unclear. She could see the dots blurring, the lines losing their usual meaning. Thomas came closer to her again, his breathing quickened. "This isn't just a geographic glitch," he said, pointing at the screen. "This looks like some kind of temporal shift, or an error. An error in time itself. Look, these coordinates don't make any sense at all. They don't match up with any point we know of." Emily kept her eyes on the screen. That was right. Those coordinates weren't just out of alignment. They led to a point that didn't exist now, but somewhere in the past, or maybe in the future. She tried to remember where she'd seen that point, and then the memory hit her like lightning. It was a place that had appeared in their training. A place they'd trained in weeks ago, but this place looked different. It wasn't the same. It was changed. "We're not alone here," Emily said, her heart clenching. Her words echoed in the void. Thomas strained, searching her eyes as if trying to figure out what she meant. But before he could say anything, the air around them shifted again, as if something invisible were compressing space. They're already here, Emily whispered. The words sounded like a glimmer of truth in an ocean of doubt. But what did they mean? Who were they? Emily didn't know, but the feeling was eerie. It wasn't just a subconscious guess. It was a feeling that they weren't alone in this broken time. Someone, or something, had been here before. And it was watching them. Suddenly, the fog around them began to shift. It was like there was a movement in the fabric of reality itself, as if it were beginning to fracture. Emily saw flashes of light running across the perimeter of their field of vision, but these flashes were not real. They were not generated by the physical world. They were distorted streams of time, fragments, random remnants. "Let's get out of here," Thomas said, his voice full of fear but also determination. He grabbed her hand, trying to pull her back to reality. But she knew they couldn't leave. They were here for a reason, and if they tried to leave this place, it would consume them. This wasn't just a physical place anymore. It was a field of choices where there were no right decisions. Emily looked at him, but there was no longer the usual concern in her eyes. Now she felt a strange, invisible connection to what was happening. She knew that their only chance was to understand what was happening before it consumed everything around them. "We can't. We have to go through with this." "This is no accident, Thomas," she said firmly. He nodded silently, knowing that he wouldn't be able to stop her this time. He knew that they had already gone too far, and that perhaps their path now was not just salvation, but a way to restore broken time. And in that moment, as if in response to her words, the space around them began to fold. The darkness began to dissipate, and with it, the distortions disappeared. Emily and Thomas found themselves back on the same field, but it was different now. This was no simple training ground. This was a place that was now far more significant. Their actions here were not just random, they were part of something that was happening at the very heart of reality's destruction. But that same point opened up before them again, and, approaching it, they felt that it was no longer possible to go back. The fog they had felt before seemed to have become transparent. But this transparency was not real. It did not dissipate. On the contrary, the fog began to pull them in another direction, like an invisible force pulling them toward the center, where time seemed to lose all its usual parameters. Emily felt her body moving, but not according to the laws of physics. Her steps were becoming lighter, but at the same time heavier. In each of her movements there was a sharp, painful moment, as if her existence was broken, but this broken existence, nevertheless, moved forward through this strange labyrinth. Thomas walked alongside them, his face contorted with tension, his eyes searching for something that might explain what was happening. He had tried several times to establish contact with the outside world, but each time his instruments and devices lost the signal, dissolved into the fog, as did all their attempts to return. It seemed that all that remained was their will to move forward. "Emily, are you sure this is the right place?" Thomas finally broke the silence, his voice laced with noticeable anxiety. Emily didn't answer right away. She felt it too, this paradox of being neither here nor there. Everything around them felt both real and not real at the same time. She felt like they were moving not just in space, but in a story that was moving through their bodies, through their minds. Everything they had experienced was already part of an event that was about to become part of something bigger than just a hurricane. "We're close," she said, though she wasn't sure she meant it. In fact, she'd just said it to reassure him. "We can't stop. We have to get through this." Thomas nodded silently and continued to walk beside her. But his movements were more cautious, as if he were searching for a path that would finally return them to the reality from which they had started. He glanced to the side. There, in the murky space, at the edge of their vision, a figure flickered. His heart sank. "Did you see this?" he asked quietly, but with concern in his voice. Emily turned, but saw nothing. Just the vague outline of what might have been a shadow, distorted by nature itself. But he couldn't have been so wrong. He knew there was something. And now she began to sense that their actions, their movements, weren't simply fighting the distortion of space and time. They were part of it. But was this path more than an illusion? They hadn't gone more than a few steps when the air around them suddenly became thick, heavy. Their movements began to slow, as if the world itself didn't want them there. Emily felt the air tightening around her chest, her breathing becoming more and more difficult. But she kept going despite the pressure, despite the feeling that her body didn't want to move. Thomas stopped, feeling the same wave of anxiety. He raised his hand to his forehead, his eyes widening in realization. "This isn't just a hurricane," he whispered. "This isn't just a time anomaly. We're in the middle of something much bigger. This space isn't just real. We've become part of it." Emily looked at him and realized he was right. Something was happening to them on a level they couldn't yet understand. Perhaps they were encountering something beyond their knowledge. The anomalies they were seeing were increasingly like something that defied conventional explanation. It wasn't just a disruption in time, it was a disruption to the very fabric of their perception of reality. As if in response to these thoughts, the space around them changed again. This time the fog wasn't just thick, it was heavy, like black liquid. It clung to them like a viscous substance, making movement increasingly difficult. Emily felt a chill in the air that wasn't from the wind, but from something larger, more incomprehensible. "We're almost there," she said again, trying to sound confident. But now, for all her efforts, she wasn't sure either. Everything seemed so unpredictable, so fluid, that every thought they had could be part of this process. Tomas в очередной раз остановился, уставившись на приборы, которые все больше показывали аномальные отклонения. Он проверил их снова и снова, но ничего не менялось. Эффективно. Его голос снова стал напряженным. Они искажаются не просто во времени. Они сдвигаются по направлению, которого не существует. Мы не находимся в одном времени, Эмили, и находимся в его середине. Точки разлома. Она посмотрела на его приборы. Наконец, поняла, что он имел в виду. Все происходящее не просто изменяло пространство вокруг них. Это изменяло и саму структуру их восприятия. Оказавшись в центре этой аномалии, они начали становиться частью ее. Эта точка разлома не была просто физическим пространством. Это было место, где пересекались разные линии времени, где одно существование накладывалось на другое. И в этот момент произошло нечто, что они не могли бы ожидать. Туман перед ними вдруг рассеялся, но не полностью. Теперь перед ними возникла не просто открытая равнина. Это было нечто большее. Это была пустота. Место, где не было ни времени, ни пространства, но которое все-таки существовало, если можно было так сказать. Томас с Эмили остановились. Их дыхание стало глубоким и замедленным. Вокруг них не было ничего, ни звуков, ни движения, ни даже обычных природных признаков. Фигура перед ними медленно начала принимать форму, становясь все более четкой и отчетливой, как если бы пространство вокруг нее переставало существовать. Сначала это было просто расплывчатое облако, смутные контуры, которые были почти неразличимы, но затем стали явными. Фигура человека, облаченная в черный костюм с искаженными шевронами, которые перемещались и менялись, как тени, играющие на стенах. Лицо было скрыто, как и раньше, под капюшоном или шлемом, который не позволял рассмотреть детали. Этот силуэт выглядел чуждым всему, что было вокруг, но в его присутствии ощущалась невероятная плотность времени и пространства. Томас и Эмили не могли отвести взгляд. The figure didn't move, but its presence was so palpable that it seemed to be changing around it. The watches on their wrists slowed, the gauges became even more distorted, and the air around them grew cold and sticky. Emily felt a chill rise on the back of her neck, but it wasn't fear. It wasn't fear from what she was seeing, it was fear from not knowing what to do with it. You see it? Thomas whispered, his voice shaking. He wasn't asking to confirm his doubts. He was asking because he knew the answer no longer mattered. Everything had become so strange that it didn't matter whether anyone saw it or not. It was a reality that no longer obeyed their perceptions. Emily couldn't answer because her own thoughts were jumbled. With each passing moment, their understanding of the world around them grew blurrier. Everything in this place seemed to intersect, events, memories, emotions. She didn't know where she was or who she was. What was this place anyway? Why were they standing here, in front of this being that didn't seem to exist in their understanding of time and space? She took a step forward, not knowing what she was looking for. For some reason, she felt like she needed to get closer. Maybe the answer was there, in that figure. Or maybe it was just the next step she needed to take to stay in touch with reality. But before she could take another step, the figure emitted a light. It was bright, but not blinding. The light was warm, like early morning sunlight, but also cold, as if it permeated her entire being. This light was not physical. It was something else, something elusive, as if the energy of time itself was manifesting itself as a visual effect that could not be understood in terms of material reality. The light illuminated the space around them, and they both froze. At first it was quiet. So quiet that Emily didn't even notice how she herself had become part of this light. She felt her consciousness dissolving, her thought process merging with this light. In that moment it became clear to her. This was not just existence. It was a process that encompassed everything around her. She was not just a part of this light. She was its expression, its extension. Thomas froze too. It was as if he felt that everything around him no longer made sense. He was no longer here. He was in another place, in another time, in another consciousness. But how is that possible? It can't be, he said, his voice weak and unsure. His words made no sense, no logic. He tried to rationalize, but his mind refused to work. This was not physical reality, but something else, something that could not be explained in words. It was the feeling of everything he had ever known crumbling to dust. But there was something else too, not something that could be understood or comprehended within the framework of conventional logic. It was knowledge. The knowledge that they had become part of something vast, and in that moment he knew that they could not go back. They could not leave. Emily turned, her eyes meeting Tom's, but they were no longer seeing each other. They were in another place. She could no longer understand him, because she was part of that other. She felt something deep and ancient, as if the very fabric of time and space began to move in her body. And at that moment, the figure spoke. Not with words. No, it was something more. It was information that came not through hearing, but through the very fabric of their existence. It was a vibration that penetrated every cell, every corner of their consciousness. You can't go back, it said in their heads, a hazy echo that made their hearts beat faster. You're already part of the process. Time is not a line. It doesn't obey your perception. You are part of what destroys reality, and you will be the ones who restore it. It's your choice. The figure's words penetrated their consciousness like a river that tears away everything in its path, but in its waters there is purification. These words made no sense, but at the same time they opened entire worlds in their minds. It was not a question of what they heard. The question was that these words had already become part of their existence. Emily took a step back, her body no longer obeying her thoughts. She was alien to herself, alien to everything that had been before. She felt her heart beating in unison with this new state. She could no longer think as before. Everything had changed. Thomas stood next to her, but his eyes were empty. He was part of this too. He was part of this crazy process too. The figure took a step forward, and the space around them changed even more. They weren't just in a void anymore. They were in the center of chaos, in the center of something that was being destroyed and restored at the same time. Time was becoming irreversible and fluid. And in that moment, Emily knew they couldn't go back. They couldn't leave. But they could be part of something much bigger than just escaping a hurricane. And this wasn't just a choice. It was an inevitability. The fog disappeared, leaving behind not emptiness, but a strange state, as if space had been compressed into a point where the usual boundaries no longer existed. Emily tried to comprehend what was happening, but her thoughts did not fit. The same silhouette stood before her, but now its appearance was not so blurred. Its figure became clear and well-defined, but its details. She could not understand what this entity was and what it wanted from them. Thomas, standing next to him, looked like a lost man, as if something important was slipping away from him, but he couldn't find what was lost. His face was indifferent, his eyes unfocused, as if he was not here, but in another place, in another time. All his efforts were directed not at resistance, but at understanding how to fit into this new world, where the laws of logic and time were blurred. "Who are you?" Emily asked, though she knew it was an unanswerable question. The figure before them did not respond with words. There was a different logic to its movements than that of humans. It did not violate the space, but simply was present in it. As strange as it may sound, it did not seem hostile. On the contrary, it seemed that everything that was happening was not their decision. It was simply the result of some natural process. They could not be indifferent to it. Emily felt her body react again to the strange, elusive light that emanated from the figure. Everything around her began to slowly change again, and she felt the space around her and Thomas pulsate, as if reality itself was connected to something much deeper than simple physics. But here's the strange thing. Throughout all of these changes, Emily felt no fear. No organ in her body was telling her to run. Instead, she felt a deep, almost physical pull, as if she were part of something that was beginning to fill her inner space. All of her experiences, her worries, even her fears, all of them became part of what was happening. They were, in fact, merging with it. Thomas took a step back, his body remaining tense, his breathing growing heavier. He grabbed the instruments, which showed even stranger data, a shift in the space-time fabric, zero coordinates that should not exist under normal circumstances. We're at the center, Emily, he said, his voice muffled, as if he didn't know what he was saying. We're not here. We're not there. We're at the intersection, where space breaks. Emily felt his words sink into her, and she wondered if she had ever been here, or if this was just a continuation of the journey they had begun when the anomaly first began to manifest. And how had her actions become part of this process? She looked at Thomas, and her gaze froze as she noticed that his eyes were different. It was impossible not to notice. His eyes were no longer the same. There was nothing human about them. They were empty, as if everything that made him a person had been stripped from them. He was lost, and his lostness was part of something else, something larger. He was part of this anomaly, just like she was. Why had they come here? Why was this happening to them? But the most important questions were perhaps not about what was happening, but about what wasn't happening. The distorted reality gave them nothing concrete, but there was something more than chaos in its space. Something that seemed the same, but couldn't be. The figure in front of them moved again. It was a step, but not a physical one. It was a movement that was not connected to space. It was as if she had stepped outside of reality, but at the same time remained within it. Emily could not understand how this was possible. Thomas felt his hands begin to shake, and instinctively he brought them to his chest. He tried to feel his body, to sense it, but instead of returning to familiar reality, he felt everything around him become shaky and blurry again. He tried to find points of support, but they disappeared the moment he tried to fixate on something. Emily walked toward him, her steps so light that she didn't even feel like she was moving. Time was dissolved, and everything that happened had no connection to the ordinary laws of life. Every movement she made became part of something that didn't exist. She was no longer a person in the sense that she and Thomas understood. She was part of something much larger, something unclear, something unknown. But at the same time, she felt that it was her actions that could influence the future. You don't understand what's going on, do you? She said, her tone light, almost weightless, addressing Thomas. But her words didn't sound like a question. They were a statement. She already knew that everything that was happening was part of something. It was inevitable. Thomas looked up at her, as if he were seeing her anew. His gaze was unlit, but at the same time it reflected the knowledge they were both trying to understand. He answered quietly, "We can't understand. We've already become part of it. We can't go back, Emily." Emily realized he was right. They were in this place, but not by choice. They were part of something else, something beyond their control. At some point, their actions became part of something that was not what they knew, but something that was destroying and restoring at the same time. The figure before them stepped back, and the space changed again. Now, instead of being empty, they were in the center of what looked like a giant chapel, filled with the same light they had seen before, but now there were shadows and movement. Images flickered around them like a kaleidoscope. These weren't just memories. These were images of their lives, but as if they had never left this place. Suddenly, Emily realized they couldn't go back. They were already here. They were already part of what was unfolding. And there was something irreversible about it. When space took form again, it became something other than just emptiness or form. It became an entity that had no beginning or end. It was not just physical reality, but something much deeper. An ineffable power hung in the air, as if the energy of time itself had taken on a physical form. Everything around them seemed to be covered in light, not hard, but fuzzy and soft, almost misty, as if they were once again in another layer of reality. But there was an uncertainty hidden in that light, like something invisible that affected space and consciousness. Emily and Thomas stood before the very images that had flickered before their eyes. They were in some fuzzy memory, not in real life, but in a reflection of it that hid the truth. Every moment became transparent, and every choice became irrelevant, because in fact, everything they did was the choice that was predetermined, just like an old reflection in a mirror that no one can erase, even if they try. Thomas looked at Emily again, but his gaze was empty, unfocused. His body was there, but his thoughts were elsewhere, as if he were in another time, another place, or another mind entirely. Everything was distorted to the point that he couldn't quite tell what was happening. But despite this, he felt a certain stability within himself. A stability that was impossible to find in the reality he was used to. He began to understand that their presence here was not an accident. It was a process that was inevitable. "This isn't just a hurricane," he said quietly, as if trying to process what he just said. "This isn't just a storm. This is..." And something much bigger. Emily didn't answer. She couldn't find the words. She already felt that no words or explanations could convey what she was experiencing. It was beyond any logic, beyond any reason. There was nothing in her mind that could explain what was happening, but she felt it. It was like that moment when you remember something important, but you can't formulate the thought itself. Everything seemed to be happening in one moment, in one space, where all the events merged and intertwined. Her gaze slid over the surface, and she saw that image again, the one that had seemed to her at first only a shadow. It was not a person, but something that existed outside her perception. It was not an external object. It was a symbol, a code that defined her being, her meaning. The figure before them had changed now. It was no longer standing still. It was beginning to move, but in a way that nothing physical could move. It was more of a wave-like movement, like the vibrations on the surface of water that spread from one point but have no physical form. And now this vibration was beginning to take over everything around them. "Do you understand that?" Thomas asked, his voice deepening, as if he already knew the answer but couldn't find the words to articulate it. Emily sighed. Her breathing became heavy, unnaturally deep. She felt her thoughts begin to fade again, as if she were part of something far older and more mysterious than her mind could comprehend. She tried to focus, but every step she took felt like a step into nothingness. Time had no meaning here, stretched out and shimmered in her mind like a sound that would not fade. Her body was here, but her soul was somewhere else, with another entity. "We're not here by chance," she said, using words that would have seemed absurd to her just a few minutes ago. "We're part of what's happening. We've become part of this process, just like everyone else." Thomas turned to face her, his face nothing more than a blank reflection of his own thoughts. "So what now?" he asked. It wasn't a question about the future, but rather about what they were doing with what was already happening. Emily couldn't answer. All their actions and questions were part of something they themselves couldn't understand. They were part of this chain of events that continued to unfold, despite their wishes or doubts. The figure in front of them continued to change, its shape becoming more and more blurred. But the more it blurred, the more they felt its presence. It was not just an object, it was something more. It was something alive, absorbing everything. Time, space, consciousness, it was all absorbed, and they could not escape it. Emily felt a strange warmth. It was like the feeling she got when she was in a moment of complete inner peace. There was no worry in her heart. There were no questions in her mind. It was a state she might have been striving for all her life, but now it was here, in the very depths of her being. Thomas felt it too. He felt his thoughts clouding over, his consciousness becoming part of what was happening. He knew they couldn't go back, that they were already part of this process. There was no other path than the one they had already started. All they could do was keep moving forward, but not in a physical sense. They were moving along some other trajectory, like traveling through many layers of reality. "We're already here," Thomas repeated, not taking his eyes off the figure. "We can't stop it. We can't go back. We're part of it, Emily." Emily stood next to him, but her body was not there. She could already sense that they were not just watching what was happening. They were part of this very process, this change that was happening beyond their understanding. The light that emanated from the figure began to intensify. It filled the space, but it was no longer soft and blurry. It became bright and intense, like the light you see only in the most critical moments, when everything around you suddenly takes on a different meaning. And this light was now something alive, pulsating, as if it itself had become a being that experiences the sensation of being. We became a part of it, Emily said, her voice almost lost in the light, but she knew she was speaking the truth. Thomas was silent. He felt the space around them changing, and everything that was happening was becoming less and less real in the usual sense. They were not just part of this world. They were part of something much bigger. The figure moved forward slowly, and at that moment everything that was happening finally began to submit to this entity. They could not understand what this meant, but they knew one thing: they were here, and it was inevitable. As the light from the figure filled the space, everything around them became fuzzy, as if the boundaries of reality they knew were beginning to disappear. The space before them seemed to stretch, as if the very fabric of time was losing its density. All the colors around them began to blur, and clarity was lost. Emily felt her perception becoming more and more multifaceted and blurry. She no longer perceived space as a single whole, but as a collection of layers, each with its own life. Thomas stood there, his breathing coming sharp and fast, as if he were trying to fight what was happening. He knew they couldn't get out of this, but his mind kept fighting. He kept trying to remember something important, something from his life that would bring him back to reality, but all memories were becoming abstractions, illusions, blurring before him. His body no longer seemed to obey his mind. He felt his hands starting to shake, but he couldn't figure out why. It wasn't fear. It was something else, as if his own existence was blurring. The light continued to pulse, and with each pulse the space around them became more and more distorted. Emily noticed that the figure standing before them no longer had a clear shape. It was like a projection on a screen, distorted in different directions. It was something alive, merging with the surrounding world and transforming it. It was not something alien, on the contrary, it was what was supposed to be. And in that moment Emily understood, they became a part of it. Not literally, not as physical bodies, but as something greater that defied ordinary perception. Thomas tried to step back, but his legs wouldn't move, as if they didn't belong to him. Everything had become excessively slow, as if time itself was blurring. He realized that perhaps it wasn't just space that was changing. He had become part of time. His movements had become part of this distorted fabric, and now his perceptions were changing with every second's hesitation. The space, his movements, were all connected to something much greater. "Did you feel it?" he asked, his voice seeming to drown in the space. He wasn't sure his words had reached Emily, but she turned to him. Her eyes were empty, but there was no fear or panic in it. She was part of this light, part of what was happening. There was a calmness in her gaze, as if she had realized something important. She couldn't explain it, but she felt that they were no longer just participants in this anomaly. They were part of it. "Yes, I feel it," she said quietly, as if her words weren't directed at Thomas but simply flowing out of her, merging with this space. "We changed what was. We became a part of it, not because we wanted to, but because there was no other way." Thomas looked at her carefully. His eyes were full of questions, but he knew she was right. They weren't just observers of this process. They were what was happening. Every move they made, every choice they made, was part of something they couldn't control. And yet, they kept moving forward. They couldn't go back. But the longer they stood in this place, the more a strange silence arose in it. It was not muffled or dead, it was unconscious. As if the space was still vibrating, but the vibrations were no longer audible. They felt it in their bodies, in their thoughts. It was like the state when you sense the presence of something, but you cannot understand what it is. And then this strange light, which was still filling the space, suddenly began to change. It didn't just get brighter or dimmer. It gradually began to take on forms that Emily and Thomas couldn't understand. It was as if this light was a living being that began to manifest and change, interacting with their own thoughts and feelings. They began to discern some strange patterns in its waves, not geometric, but rather emotional, as if their inner experiences were being reflected in the space around them. Thomas tried to step forward again. His body moved slowly, as if it did not have its usual solidity. But there was no fear in this movement. On the contrary, he felt a certain calm, as if some deep mechanism of this reality was now in their hands. Emily took a step toward the figure, which now seemed even less defined than before. Everything about its movement was fluid, almost silent. She knew that this was no mere illusion, no mere projection of their fear or emotion. This was something more real than the world they had once known. It was a reality in which time, space, consciousness, and existence merged into a single whole they could no longer understand. "We did it," Emily said. It wasn't a question, more of a statement. She knew they weren't random participants in this process. She knew they were part of this force that was changing everything. Thomas, without waiting for an answer, slowly approached the figure, but suddenly its form began to disappear. Its light began to fade into the void, and the space around them began to rapidly change again. It was like the fabric of the world was being torn apart, as if not only space but reality itself was beginning to disintegrate. The pulsations of light grew stronger. Thomas realized that they were not just witnesses to the changes. They were what was changing this reality. At some point, everything around them disappeared, leaving only emptiness. But this emptiness was not dark. It was not lifeless. It was filled with something new, something that Emily and Thomas could neither see nor understand. But it did not matter. This was not just a state, but the end of their journey. They couldn't go back. They weren't the same anymore. But what was around them gave them no fear, no pain. It was something much deeper. It was what they were looking for. And they found it. The sounds disappeared and the light went out. Everything returned to an unknown silence. And only the fog, which had now become something of their own, continued to dissipate. There was nothing familiar about this strange, almost hypnotic peace that surrounded Emily and Thomas. The missing sounds did not mean that the world was dead. On the contrary, in this silence they felt an extraordinary fullness, as if the whole world at that moment had been reduced to one endless moment. And this moment was neither the beginning nor the end. It was something that lay between them, like something elusive, defying analysis and explanation. But as strange as it might sound, the sensation was not frightening. Instead, it was relaxing, calming, though not without a strange, vague menace. Emily felt her thoughts and feelings becoming inseparable. They were no longer separate and linear. Everything in her mind was in flux, as if she were in the past, the future, and the present all at once. It was as if the time she had once believed in had no meaning, and everything she had ever known was merely a reflection of something much deeper. Her eyes remained open, but she was no longer looking around. Instead, her gaze was directed inward, to the very center of her consciousness, where thoughts, experiences, memories were mingling. She couldn't understand what was happening to her mind, but it was like her individuality was dissolving into endless layers of something greater. And in that moment, Emily felt not fear, but a strange relief. She understood that her personality was just one part of an unimaginably complex mechanism that had never been limited by her perception. Thomas, standing nearby, felt the change too. His gaze was fixed on the spot where the figure had been a moment ago, now gone. He knew that they had not simply vanished from space, but had become part of this void, not vanished, but transformed. He felt his thoughts slipping out of control, as if his mind no longer obeyed any rules or laws of physics that he knew. All his notions of reality, of time, of actions, of consequences, were crumbling, like a sandcastle sinking into the void, leaving no trace. "We won't go back. We can't anymore." The words that came into his head were not his own. They were not thoughts, but rather understanding, a realization that flashed like lightning in the dark night sky, illuminating everything around them. He knew that they were on the threshold of something inevitable. But what? Something that could not be explained in any terms. This was not a simple change in reality, but a self-transformation. Their path, their existence, their actions, all of it had led them here. And then the space around them began to change shape. It was no longer empty and vague. Small vibrations began, and they began to feel the space coming alive, as if something invisible were beginning to materialize around them. At first, these were just weak, barely noticeable changes, lines that could hardly be called physical. But then these lines began to change, to expand, to form unimaginable patterns that flowed smoothly and continuously into space. Each line was like a trace left by a thought or a desire that had once emanated from them, and now it was becoming part of this reality. These lines had no shape. They were ever-changing waves on which fragments of their experiences, their actions, were inscribed. And suddenly, amidst these smooth changes, a thought flashed through their minds. What if all this had already happened? Emily felt her consciousness begin to react to the question, though she couldn't quite comprehend what it meant. It wasn't a question of past or future, but of the nature of time. She didn't know how it had happened, but now all her actions, all her steps, seemed timeless. She saw them not as events, but as traces that simply sat in this eternal loop. Everything, from her first step to her last, was predetermined, but not in a fatalistic sense. It was as if it had already happened, and they were merely experiencing it in their limited reality. Thomas couldn't immediately process what he had just felt. His gaze, still fixated on those strange lines and patterns, began to shift towards Emily. He didn't know what to say, because the same question was forming in his head. What if everything that was happening wasn't linear, as he had once thought? What if their path, their decisions were already part of something that was happening in another time, another place? The questions multiplied, but the answers seemed out of reach. Yet this process, this merging of their consciousnesses with this transforming reality, continued. The space around them was not just space. It was something that consisted of memories, experiences, events that had no logic, but at the same time seemed infinitely interconnected. And the more they felt it, the clearer it became that they were at the center of this process. And suddenly Emily noticed how those same lines and patterns began to merge, becoming denser, their shapes becoming more concrete. They began to form something that was familiar, but at the same time incredibly alien. In the center of those lines, vague shapes began to appear, which formed a landscape, like something that could be their world, but somehow different, distorted. It was their familiar place, but there was no logic to it, no time, no space. Everything was folded into multi-layered reflections, fragments of a reality that could no longer exist according to the usual laws. They stood in this changed world, as if absorbed by this existence of which they had become a part. Everything around them had changed, but in this change there was no destruction, but rebirth. And yet, they both felt that only now were they beginning to understand how they were connected to this place and this process. The world they now experienced was no longer something abstract, alien, or frightening. Instead of weighing on their minds, it began to merge their consciousnesses into one, not dividing them into individuals, but turning them into something greater than just two people. In this space, there was no time or space in the usual sense. All their lives, their decisions, their feelings were now just threads in a huge network that formed a new continuum. But the strangest thing was that they did not feel like exiles, but part of something that already existed. As if they were part of some ancient process, unconsciously rolling through centuries, time and space. Arta bulla novri izmirania, sushestvushia za predelami poнимания. S каждым шагом по этому странному миру их ощущения становились все более интенсивными. Ощущения как будто были все. Томас начал замечать, что здесь, в этом пространстве, не существует ни закона гравитации, ни привычных физических условий. Все было иным. Он мог ощущать, как его мысли не просто следуют за его волей, но также становятся частью мира, в котором он находился. Он почувствовал, как его сознание медленно переходит от простого восприятия происходящего к глубокому осознанию. Это было не просто физическое ощущение, это было чувство, что его сознание уже не привязано к его телу. Эмили шагнула вперед. Ее движение было плавным, как будто ее тело было частью этой новой ткани реальности. Она оглянулась на Томаса, и их взгляды встретились, но не было слов. Они оба поняли, что не нуждаются в словах, чтобы понять друг друга. Все, что было между ними, теперь стало одним целым, сливающимся в этом измененном пространстве. «Это не конец», — сказала она. Ее голос был тихим, но глубоким, как резонанс, который эхом отдавался в самой ткани реальности. «Мы не можем вернуться, потому что мы уже в другом месте». Томас не ответил, но он понял. Они не были просто путешественниками, не просто исследователями этого нового мира. Они стали частью этого мира. Suddenly, the space before them began to change shape. It was not static. There was no such thing as stability or permanence in this new world. Everything was in constant motion, and these changes were not random. Each change had meaning, and each change was part of a deeper truth. A new image appeared before them. It was a figure they had seen before, but it was much clearer now, outlined as something important. It was their guiding light, their beacon in this changed world. It was not a normal human form, but there was something familiar in its curves and lines. It was not simply a projection of their past, or the past of all humanity. It was the very essence of what they needed to understand. And then Emily took a step forward, without thinking, without deliberation. She knew that her actions were going to lead to something important, and even if she couldn't explain exactly what it was, she knew that this step was necessary. As if she wasn't just stepping into the future, but was also connected to the events that were happening here and now. Thomas followed her, his mind still struggling to fully comprehend what was happening. But his body moved intuitively, as if it knew that it belonged here, and that this was the only right choice. He felt them begin to move together, as an inseparable whole, and each step they took was a step towards solving the mystery that lay before them. Everything around them was changing, but the changes weren't destructive. They were changes that opened up new horizons. And within those horizons, Emily and Thomas began to discern not only possible paths, but what was hidden within those paths themselves. They couldn't quite figure out how, but they sensed that their journey was bringing them closer to something important. As they approached the figure, it began to change shape, dissolving into a luminous pattern. Now the entire space in front of them became clearer, and they saw how these patterns were connected to their own thoughts and experiences. It was a process in which they became not just observers, but active participants. And then Emily felt her mind connecting with those patterns, with those energies that created this world. "We are here," she said. Thomas nodded without saying a word. But he knew that everything that had happened to them was just preparation for the next step, for the next understanding. Whatever was ahead, they were ready for it. Emily и Thomas стояли, наблюдая, как мир вокруг них продолжает трансформироваться. И хотя они не могли точно понять, что происходит, их сознание все больше сливалось с этим пространством, с этим новым, странным континуумом, которым они оказались. Оно было многослойным, текучим, как зыбкая вода, а время, казавшееся таким твердым и неизменным, потеряло свои привычные очертания. Именно в этот момент они почувствовали присутствие чего-то, не в буквальном смысле присутствие существа или объекта, но скорее нечто, что с каждым мгновением становилось все более очевидным. Это было как присутствие самого времени, как если бы время было сущностью, которая наблюдала за ними и их действиями. Томас, все еще держась за Эмили, чувствовал, как его тело теряет привычные очертания. Его разум постепенно терял способность отделять прошлое от настоящего, а будущее становилось едва уловимым, как туман. И хотя он не знал точно, что происходит, он ощущал, что они на самом деле не были частью этого мира в том смысле, каком он всегда думал. They continued to stand, even as the space around them changed, consuming their bodies and souls. But it was not painful. On the contrary, they felt their essences dissolving, not disappearing, but transforming. Emily looked at Thomas, and his gaze met hers. And there were no words, no need for words. They understood each other without sounds, without the need to explain. And suddenly a figure appeared before them, the same one that had been there at the beginning of their journey. But now its outlines were much clearer, almost tangible. It was no longer an abstraction, but something that could be perceived as reality, although not in the usual sense of the word. It was not a body, but something more, an entity that had no ties to the usual laws of existence. It was not a person, it was not a being, it was not something that could be limited by familiar terms. The figure spoke, its voice not ordinary, but an echo that was transmitted through the stars themselves, through space, time, and consciousness. "You have come," the voice said. "Everything you sought was always with you, but you could not see it until you allowed yourself to become part of it all." Emily and Thomas stood there, not understanding. But the feeling that they knew what this figure was talking about began to fill their hearts. They couldn't explain why, but it was true. Everything they were experiencing wasn't random. It was necessary, part of their journey. "What now?" Thomas asked. His voice was calm, but there was a sense of power inside, as if it was not his own body, but something else that now had the ability to speak. The figure did not answer immediately. Its eyes, if you could call it that, reflected infinity, as if it saw everything at once, without the limitations of time. It took a step forward, and the space around them began to change. And although they did not know what was happening, They felt that this moment was final. It was not an end, but rather the beginning of something completely new. You have always been here, the figure said. Now you are about to see what was impossible to understand before. And in that moment, Emily and Thomas understood. This was no accident. Their journey was not just a journey through space and time. It was a journey through the very essence of existence. And now they were ready to understand the truth. But there was no ending to this understanding. It was not a conclusion. It was an endless process, an eternal cycle that they had just entered. Emily and Thomas had become one with this world, dissolved into its fabric. And though they were no longer who they had been, they were part of something far greater. There was no going back, but there was no fear, no doubt. There was only understanding. And in this understanding, there was no need to look for an answer. The answer was in the process itself. Time, like space, began to disappear. Emily and Thomas no longer felt like they had individuality. They were part of this world, part of its fluid reality, but despite feeling every element around them, they knew they could no longer return. Return to what had been. What they had known before was now alien. Their bodies and minds had merged with this world, and something inside them responded in kind. They had become part of something that had always been and always would be. Now they stood, not moving, but not motionless. There was no concept of movement in this place, no attachment to what humans call life. They felt everything at once, and the experience was both liberating and terrifying. The world around them was not what they expected. It was not an abstraction, it was not a philosophy or a myth. It was being itself, the basis of all that exists. The figure before them, the same one they had seen before, was now not just a reflection, but a fully tangible entity. The space around her seemed to vibrate, emitting light and darkness at the same time. Her voice was penetrating their consciousness again, but not through words. It was not a voice, but a feeling that filled their inner world, its abyss, making Emily and Thomas feel as if they were inside the voice itself. "You have come," it said again. "You have always been here, and now you see it." Emily and Thomas stood there, unsure of what to say, but this was not a moment for a response. This was a moment of realization. Suddenly, the space before them split. No, not split, but rather, as if it were stratified. As if every element of this world had opened up a different perspective to them, and they were seeing what was beyond their understanding. In an instant, it wasn't a world that opened up to them, but a universe. An incredible, multi-layered, ever-changing structure in which they were nothing more than the smallest particles. But this particle was important. They felt it. They began to move, but not as before. Their movement was like an impulse in this universe. It was not a journey through space. It was a movement within reality itself, in the very fabric of existence. Each step, each movement was simultaneously here and everywhere. They were not just passengers in this flow, but a part of it, its consciousness. And their steps were not directed towards some final point, because that point no longer existed. Emily looked back at Thomas, their eyes meeting, but there were no words. They could no longer verbalize their thoughts, because those thoughts were no longer their own experiences, but part of what was around them. They sensed each other, not through feelings, but through the understanding that they were now something more than they had ever been. "We can't go back," she said finally, her voice not human but merged with the very waves of reality they were now perceiving. "We've become part of what always was. That world is gone." Thomas nodded, understanding that her words weren't just a reflection of their fears or disappointments. They were the truth they felt. Everything was connected, and their entire lives hadn't just been a preparation for this moment. This was the moment of completion of a journey they had begun in a way they didn't usually think of as journeys. It was more than they could comprehend, but none of it was random. Not random. "We don't know what's going to happen next," Thomas said. But his words were not filled with fear, but with calm, with acceptance. The figure came toward them again, but it was not human. It was something much greater. It was not existence as we know it, but something that included everything that had ever existed and would ever exist. It was an awareness of the very process of life and death, time and space, cause and effect. It looked at them not with its eyes, but as if the very essence of their perception was its gaze. Everything that came before didn't disappear. It just became a part, like you, like everything you've experienced. It's all merged now, become one. And you too, became part of something eternal, but also incomprehensible. Everything you thought you understood is just part of a deeper picture. Emily and Thomas understood. They were part of something greater than their own lives or fates. But not in the way they knew. They were parts of a system that didn't require human understanding. They weren't just saviors, not just people who had survived a hurricane. They were part of a process, part of a universe that never stopped moving. Thomas felt his consciousness begin to merge with this space again. He no longer felt like a separate person. There was no longer an I. Everything that had come before didn't matter. There was only a moment, an endless moment, in which he and Emily were part of something much larger. And they were ready to embrace it as their new reality. Because now there was no before or after. With this moment, with this meeting, they became part of an eternal movement. And was this the end or the beginning? It didn't really matter. Time and space didn't exist here. Thomas took Emily's hand, and they stood on the edge of this world, no longer feeling any fear or doubt. They were part of something vast and eternal. They were at the very center of what had always been and always would be. And despite all their attempts to reclaim themselves, all that remained was perception, the feeling that they had finally understood. In this new reality, there was no end and no beginning. There was only endless movement.
More interesting thing to come. Be sure to watch the next video or check you the playlist. There you will find even more yourself and exciting. Thanks for the likes, comments and your support. It really helps to develop the channel.